What is human security? Just very generally, human security involves a focus on the security for the individual rather than from the state, imposed by the state, and focuses on the well-being, safety, and dignity of individual human beings, and focuses on protection and empowering individuals and communities to develop the capabilities for making informed choices and acting on their own behalf. And restorative justice, Roz just gave us an overview a few minutes ago, so I'll be very brief. Focus on violation of people and relationships versus violation of the law. Focus on accountability and obligations of offenders to make things right. And a focus on involving the victim, the offender, and the community in a process in a search for solutions that promote repair, reconciliation, and healing. So the common elements are focus on people, focus on the needs of victims, focus on community, working within community. And so what can restorative justice do to further human security? It's the question. First of all, it allows one to focus on the needs and concerns of victims, and I don't need to elaborate on that point. Provides a basis for community participation, kind of requires community participation, is able to get at the root causes of crime, to get past the legalistic sort of definitions of the situation and say, well, what lay behind that? And focuses on, related to that, is able to focus on the different levels of truth, the level of the personal, social healing truth, and the social truth and the healing truth, and not just the factual and forensic truth, the legalistic truth of the situation. So human rights violations by peacekeepers. This sort of scandal sort of hit in 1999, where it emerged that in New Guinea, young girls were being exploited. Young girls 13 to 18 were being exploited in terms of sexually. And this is an offense. The sort of the human rights violations refers to sexual exploitation of various kinds. So after this story came out from New Guinea, it emerged that there were similar violations in a variety of countries from different parts of the world, from the Republic of Congo, Liberia, Haiti, Kosovo. And so the UN was feeling some pressure on this and initiated an investigation in 2002 by the Open-Ended Working Group on Assistance and Support to Victims of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. Anyway, they investigated 72 cases and concluded the majority of victims were young girls, 12 to 18, forced to engage in survival sex in exchange for food. So the UN response was to identify core principles for humanitarian workers. First of all, and this is an essential part of any kind of restorative process, really, is to establish that the behavior is wrong. And to define that in terms of harm done to people. The core principles for humanitarian workers include the prohibition of sexual relations with children under the age of 18, the prohibition of exchange of money, employment, goods or services, etc., for sex, including sexual favors or other forms of humiliating, degrading, or exploitative behavior. Strong discouragement of sexual relationships between humanitarian workers and beneficiaries. The obligation to report suspicions regarding sexual abuse, and charging managers and directors and so on with the responsibility for ensuring the implementation of codes of conduct. Also, to their credit, they identified a number, and I've just identified some key clauses here. They've identified what a focus on victims and identified key aspects of that. So that the victims should receive assistance and support in accordance with their individual needs directly arising from the alleged exploitation and abuse, including medical service, legal services, support to deal with the psychological and social effects of the experience, etc. And victims should receive additional assistance and support in accordance with their individual needs arising directly from the exploitation, and all assistance and support should be provided in a manner that does not increase the trauma suffered by the complainants. The response has been, to some extent, well, that's all very well and good, but what about implementation, or what about enforcement? Where do we go from here? Well, that's not entirely fair. The UN has, I should say, they have worked at educating, sending educators out to make people aware of this as an issue. They have the blue helmets. They talk about the blue peacekeepers, the blue helmets, and one of the clauses, they're all given a card with some basic principles presented on the card. And one of them is a directive that sexual exploitation is wrong. So they've done that, but then, well, you get the standard thing that you get in all sorts of situations, as Roz will tell you, is, well, what about punishment? What do we do? Well, there are some special problems with punishment in this kind of situation. So you have, well, and I certainly don't approve of this, but you do have a long history of sexual exploitation on the part of soldiers. These peacekeepers are soldiers, and it's the tradition of raping and looting and so it's like there's a military culture around that, which is one obstacle. Maybe there are other things. Jurisdictional issues. Well, they're saying that the offenders should be tried in their country of origin. So that would have these peacekeepers go back to their country and stand trial. Now, there's some problems with that in countries where probably people aren't particularly in favor of sending their soldiers over to be peacekeepers. To have them come back and be tried for offenses committed while doing that. Anyway, it hasn't worked at all. So that's a major issue, as well. Where does in any kind of a judicial process, where does the support for victims? Even assuming you could take this back to. Oh, another thing is that in some of these countries don't even have the kind of age restrictions that we have, like the 18 and under rule. So it might not even work in terms of their judicial system. But, well, even if you could do that, say the soldiers could go back to France, which apparently there was attempted, and they could have a trial, wherein in that is a mechanism to help victims, which is obviously a key part of this. And add to that, unrealistic expectations in general with regard to retribution and what it can do. And we've talked about that a bit already.
I was particularly struck by number 9 previously, that they would be given help to not be re-traumatized, etc.
Yeah.
Well, there's no way that can be mandated because of various things that we've heard about the fact that raped women are cast out and their children are certainly stigmatized, etc. And you're not going to change that by some kind of ruling.
No, and we have in our relatively enlightened culture. I mean, it's an awful history of having rape victims come in and appear in court and being torn apart by prosecutors. With this particular situation, and these particular difficulties with this kind of case are only symptomatic of broader problems with judicial processes in general. And I'll just go through this very quickly now. identified by a woman named Martha Meno. 3 problems. Retroactivity, just because it's an offense now in a post-conflict situation, doesn't mean it was an offense while this was happening. And I don't know if anyone saw the Rwanda film. The man said, at the time, it was not a crime when we did it. So then subsequently it becomes a crime. So there's always that sort of defense or rationalization, if you like. Secondly, politicization. Judicial processes are always kind of victor's justice to a degree. And even the most famous case, the most successful case of a judicial process, the Nuremberg trials, in which Nazi war criminals were tried and convicted, that was great. But in the meantime, the Allies were firebombing Japanese cities and dropping nuclear bombs onto Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In terms of sheer loss of human life and human suffering, arguably comparable. But nothing ever came of that. And finally, selectivity is who do you charge? Ideally, like you can't, as Roz was saying, you can't charge everybody. So you should charge like the worst offenders or the leaders, people who initiated things. And but what most often happens is that those people at the lowest levels, like Abu Ghraib, people at the very lowest levels end up getting charged. And you're going to say, well, I was told to do it. I needed to keep my position, and so on. So all sorts of problems. So I would argue, and we've probably got some exposure to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and so on. The model is usually the South African model is the most widely quoted, probably the most successful, although not perfect. A process of, basically, just to identify, a process whereby victims can come forward and tell their stories, whereby perpetrators can come forward and be accountable without necessarily facing a punishment for it, and where you can get at the levels of truth. The factual and forensic or legal truth is one thing. The personal narrative truth, the victim's stories, is quite another, and these have been found to be enormously beneficial. The social dialogue truth, the story of accountability, which can then take into context into not just the lower level people, but the whole hierarchy in the situation. Also the bystanders. What were other people doing? These are all part of the stories that need to be told. And if these stories can come out, then it's possible to work toward a healing and restorative truth, or at least in terms of some kind of reparation and repair. I think if we think in terms of restoratively, in these kinds of situations, we can take a step in the right direction, rather than sort of hurrying off in the wrong direction, which has been the pattern so much in the past. And I'm not sure how exactly it would work, full-fledged Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, or perhaps town hall meetings, supported by victim offender mediation programs and healing circles at a more grassroots level. But as ways of allowing the victims to tell their stories and to really confront the offenders, because if they go home back to Sweden or wherever and tell their they'll never be exposed to the harm that they've done. And it's easy to rationalize, say, well, they needed the food, I was helping them, So restorative justice processes can be employed to further human security in post-conflict societies, and such processes should be seen in the context of formal legal definition of wrongdoing on the one hand, as the UN has done, and broader efforts toward reconstruction and peace building on the other. Because like the question came up about recidivism rates and so on, and part of the problem with that is that crimes occur in a context. So you can have a very successful healing process, a healing circle or a mediation, but then if you put those people back into that environment with all the pressures on them, that pushes them back in the same direction. So anyway, that's all. Thank you.